What would you do if, thousands of feet above the ground, you were told you didn't belong on your own flight? What if the very person sworn to protect your safety turned against you, not because of rules, but because of prejudice tonight? We step into the story of Evelyn Carter, a woman who boarded a plane expecting nothing more than a routine flight. Instead, she found herself face to face with a captain who tried to strip her of her dignity. But what he didn't expect was that Evelyn would not stand alone. As whispers turned into voices, and voices into a roar, an entire cabin rose with her. This isn't just a story about a flight, it's about courage, the power of truth, and the unbreakable dignity no one can take away. But here's the question when the world tells you to stay silent. Will you, or will you rise, even when your knees shake? Stay with us as we uncover every moment of this unforgettable night in the sky. And before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because stories like these deserve to be heard. The hum of the aircraft filled the air as passengers filed one by one into the cabin of the Boeing 787 bound for London. The overhead bins clicked shut. Flight attendants offered polite greetings, and a faint scent of coffee mixed with recycled air lingered around. It was a scene Evelyn Carter had experienced countless times in her life. Business trips, late-night flights, red-eye journeys across continents, this was part of her routine. Yet, on this particular evening, she felt an unusual heaviness in her chest. Perhaps it was fatigue, perhaps something deeper. Evelyn adjusted the cuff of her tailored navy blue blazer as she stepped into the business class cabin. She walked with calm, deliberate grace. Her leather bag slung across her shoulder, her phone still glowing with a half-finished message to her son, Thomas. She had promised to text him before takeoff, "Mom will call once I land. Be good. I love you." He had responded with a simple heart emoji, but she knew how much it meant. As Evelyn approached her seat, she noticed a pair of eyes tracking her every move. Standing near the cockpit door, Captain Richard Hayes, tall and broad-shouldered in his crisp pilot's uniform, furrowed his brows the moment he saw her. His arms crossed over his chest, and his lips pressed into a thin line. It wasn't a look of casual observation, it was a look of doubt, even disdain. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice low but firm, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Can I help you find your seat?" Evelyn paused, holding his gaze. "I know exactly where my seat is. Thank you." Her tone was even polite, but it carried a note of finality. Hayes's eyes flicked toward the boarding pass still in her hand. He extended his palm, a gesture more command than courtesy. "If you don't mind, let me confirm your ticket." Sometimes passengers misread. A few heads turned. Two men already seated across the aisle leaned forward, watching the exchange with interest. Evelyn felt a flicker of heat rise in her chest. Misread, as if she were a child wandering into the wrong part of the plane. Still, she remained composed, sliding the boarding pass into his hand. He scanned it quickly, his jaw tightening. "Business class, seat 3A, he muttered. "Huh." He looked up again, almost incredulous. "Well, you're in the right place." The words hung in the air like smoke. He could have stopped there, but he didn't. Hayes leaned closer, lower in his voice, though not enough to mask the edge in his tone. "Not everyone belongs up here, you know." The comment landed like a slap. Evelyn blinked, her face calm, but her thoughts surged. She had heard variations of those words before in boardrooms, in negotiations, even in casual conversations at charity galas. Not everyone belongs. It was never about the seat, the job, the moment. It was always about her skin, her gender, the quiet audacity of her presence in places some thought she should never reach. Evelyn inhaled slowly, fighting the impulse to respond immediately. Around her, she could sense the air tightening, other passengers pretending to look away yet still straining to hear. "Excuse me," she asked softly. Her voice, though calm, carried weight. Hayes straightened his shoulders, clearly expecting her to challenge him. Instead, he smirked faintly, as if satisfied that his message had landed. "You heard me," he said, turning away toward the cockpit. Lena, Evelyn's assistant, who had been just a step behind her, whispered urgently, "Did you hear that? Are you going to let him?" "Not now," Evelyn murmured, holding up her hand. Her eyes flicked toward her seat, and she slid into it with quiet dignity. She placed her bag neatly under the seat in front of her, clasped her hands together, and sat still. Inside, however, her thoughts were anything but still. A storm was brewing. She could feel the sting of humiliation creeping up her spine. She could almost hear her son's voice. "Mom, why do they treat you like that?" And she could hear her own answer, the one she had rehearsed too many times, "Because some people don't know better, but we teach them with grace." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. She wanted to keep her calm, but every second that passed reminded her that the insult wasn't just personal. It was a reflection of something bigger, a disease still alive in the veins of society, one she had spent her entire career fighting to outgrow. The seatbelt sign dinged above. Passengers shuffled, stowing their phones, adjusting their seats. Yet Evelyn's mind was far away, replaying the pilot's words in slow motion. She could have dismissed it. She could have shrugged and told herself it didn't matter. But something inside her whispered otherwise. This was not a moment to bury. This was a moment to remember. The hum of the engines grew louder, vibrating through the cabin walls. Evelyn straightened in her seat, her face serene, but her heartbeat quickened. She glanced at Lena, who was still fuming beside her. Evelyn gave her assistant a small, steady smile. "Don't worry," she whispered. "This isn't over." And in that quiet promise, something shifted. For the first time that night, Evelyn wasn't just a passenger on a flight. She was a woman standing at the threshold of another battle, one she had not chosen, but one she would fight with the same strength that had carried her from poverty to the pinnacle of business. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and Evelyn's reflection in the window looked back at her, calm, poised, unyielding. But beneath the surface, fire burned, a fire that would soon set the entire cabin alight with truth. The day before the flight had begun like any other, though Evelyn Carter sensed there was something unusually heavy in the air. She woke in her townhouse just outside Washington, D.C., the morning sunlight slipping through sheer curtains and stretching across her bedroom walls. The faint aroma of brewed coffee reached her from the kitchen, where Lena had already arrived to organize the day. Evelyn had grown accustomed to Lena's efficiency, the way she always seemed one step ahead, still in her robe. Evelyn descended the staircase, the soft padding of her slippers muffled against the polished wood floor. The house was quiet except for the clicking of Lena's laptop keys and the occasional ring of her phone. "Good morning, Evelyn," Lena said brightly, standing to hand her a mug. "I've already pulled up the updated itinerary. The board meeting is still confirmed for 9 p.m. London time tomorrow. You'll have maybe 3 hours to rest after landing." Evelyn accepted the mug, inhaled the steam, and gave a soft smile. 3 hours is more than I usually get, but even as she sipped the hot coffee, her thoughts drifted. She knew what awaited her in London, a high-stakes negotiation with one of Europe's largest pharmaceutical firms. The outcome could determine not only the future of her company, but also the affordability of a cancer treatment her team had been developing for years. It wasn't just business, it was personal. After breakfast, Evelyn retreated to her study, walls lined with books, framed photos of her journey scattered across the shelves. There was one of her at 30, holding a small office key in her hand, her very first biotech lab behind her. Another captured her with Thomas as a toddler, his chubby fingers clutching at her necklace while she smiled through exhaustion. She stared at that photo longer than she meant to, feeling the tug of memory. Her phone buzzed. A FaceTime request lit up the screen. "Thomas," she answered instantly. His teenage face filled the screen, his curls slightly messy, his school sweatshirt slipping off one shoulder. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice casual but warm. "You packed yet almost?" Evelyn replied, leaning back in her chair. "You know me. Last-minute details." He smirked. "You mean you'll be up at midnight going over slides again?" "Guilty," she said with a laugh, "but it's important. Tomorrow could change everything." Thomas's expression softened. "You always say that, and then it does." The words touched her more than she expected. For years, she had worried about how much he carried on his young shoulders, watching her struggle, hearing whispers from outsiders about who she was and what she represented. He was old enough now to understand, at least partly, the weight of prejudice she faced. "Mom," Thomas asked after a pause, "do you ever get tired of proving yourself to people?" Evelyn set the phone down on her desk for a moment, staring at the boy who had become her anchor. His question pierced her in a way few things could. "Every day," she admitted quietly. "But then I remember why I do it. Not to prove to them, but to prove to myself and to you that we belong anywhere our work, our dreams, and our determination take us." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "I wish people would just see you the way I do." The conversation hung in the air, tender and unspoken. Evelyn wished the same, but she also knew reality rarely bent so easily. Her son would have to learn the same lesson she had. Dignity was not given, it was claimed. By afternoon, the day grew busier. Conference calls bled into one another, emails piled up, and Lena darted in and out of the study with folders, flight details, and last-minute reports. Evelyn remained calm, focused, though underneath her chest tightened with the familiar cocktail of exhaustion and determination. Dinner that evening was simple pasta, a salad Lena insisted she eat for energy. Evelyn wanted to savor every moment with Thomas, knowing she wouldn't see him for a week. They sat at the long oak dining table, just the two of them. He chatted about school, about a history project on civil rights leaders. Evelyn listened, nodding, though her mind lingered on irony. She thought about the way history was still alive in their daily lives, stitched into every glance, every unspoken assumption. Later, after dishes were cleared and Thomas had gone upstairs, Evelyn lingered alone in the living room. The fireplace glowed softly, though she hadn't lit it. She opened her journal, something she rarely showed anyone. Her handwriting filled the page. What is the cost of being visible? How many times must I defend my place before the world stops asking for proof? She paused, tapping the pen against her lips. Then she wrote again. But I cannot disappear. Not for myself, not for Thomas, not for the women watching me who need to know they are not alone. Her chest swelled as she closed the journal. Strength, she reminded herself, did not mean the absence of doubt. It meant moving forward despite it. When midnight arrived, Evelyn was still awake, revising the final version of her presentation. Lena, half asleep on the couch, stirred. "You should rest," she mumbled. "Soon," Evelyn said, but she didn't. It wasn't until that she finally allowed herself to slip into bed. She stared at the ceiling, the quiet hum of the night filling the room. For a moment, her mind drifted to the flight ahead, the faces she might meet, the boardroom waiting in London. She had no idea that her greatest confrontation would not be across a polished conference table, but 30,000 feet in the air. The following morning came too quickly. Evelyn rose before dawn, dressed in her favorite navy blue suit, the one Thomas said made her look like a superhero. Lena loaded the car with luggage, and Thomas stood at the door, reluctant to say goodbye. "Call me when you land," he reminded her. "Always." Evelyn promised, pressing a kiss to his forehead. The car pulled away, leaving Thomas in the doorway, hands shoved deep in his pockets. Evelyn glanced back once, imprinting the image in her mind. She didn't know it then, but his words from the night before would echo in her heart when she needed them most. Do you ever get tired of proving yourself? Yes. But tomorrow, on that flight, she would be reminded why stopping was never an option. And as the airport lights drew nearer, Evelyn Carter inhaled deeply, unaware that within the next 24 hours she would once again be asked, in the cruelest of ways, to prove her place in a world still reluctant to accept her. The cabin smelled faintly of leather and warm fabric softener as Evelyn Carter slid into her seat in business class. The hum of the engines was still subdued, like a low vibration waiting to rise. Passengers filed past her, murmuring in different languages, tucking bags into overhead compartments, some stealing curious glances in her direction before pretending to look away. Evelyn noticed them, though she had trained herself over the years to treat such glances as little more than background noise. She placed her handbag neatly under the seat in front of her, smoothed the crease of her blazer, and exhaled slowly. Outwardly, she was the picture of composure. Inside, however, she could still feel the sting of the pilot's remark, "Not everyone belongs up here." The words echoed in her mind like a whisper that refused to fade. Lena, seated just beside her, leaned closer, her voice sharp with indignation. "I can't believe what he said to you. Right there, in front of everyone. Evelyn, you shouldn't let that slide." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her eyes fixed on the safety card she had pulled from the seat pocket. "And what would you have me do? Create a scene before we even take off?" Her tone was calm, but Lana could hear the undertone, the restrained anger hiding behind poise. "I don't know. At least call him out. He had no right." Lena's cheeks flushed with frustration. She was younger, less accustomed to swallowing the venom of casual cruelty. To her, silence felt like surrender. But Evelyn's silence was not surrender, it was calculation. Around them, other passengers continued to settle in. A middle-aged man across the aisle scrolled on his phone. though his eyes lifted every so often to glance at Evelyn with something between curiosity and suspicion. A woman, a few rows ahead, was whispering to her companion, her gaze darting back toward seat 3A. The scrutiny was subtle but unmistakable, and Evelyn felt the weight of it pressing on her chest. She closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. This was not the first time she had been doubted, dismissed, or treated as if she were trespassing in a world she had rightfully earned access to. She reminded herself that dignity was a choice, one she had made a long time ago. Still, the cabin's atmosphere felt different tonight. There was a heaviness in the air, something beyond the recycled oxygen and faint perfume that lingered between rows. It was tension, the kind that built quietly, thread by thread, until the smallest spark could unravel it all. The flight attendants moved briskly down the aisle, offering champagne flutes and folded hot towels. When one of them stopped at Evelyn's row, there was a flicker of hesitation in her smile, as though she, too, had heard Hayes's remark. The attendant quickly recovered, handing over the towel with practiced grace, but Evelyn caught the pause. It was always in the pauses, the subtle signals, that truth revealed itself. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly, accepting the towel with a steady hand. As she pressed the warmth to her palms, she glanced out the window. The airport lights glittered like scattered jewels on the tarmac. Planes crawling along the runway like enormous beasts preparing to take flight. She had always loved this view, the feeling of leaving one place behind and racing toward another. But tonight the view felt different. Instead of anticipation, she felt a kind of watchfulness settle over her, as though the journey ahead held more than business negotiations and late-night strategy sessions. Lena leaned closer again. "Evelyn, you can't just let this guy treat you like you don't belong. Do you want me to report it to the airline? We can do it anonymously." Evelyn turned to her assistant, meeting her eyes with quiet strength. "No, not yet. Let's see where this goes." The words surprised even Lena. "See where this goes, Evelyn. What if it gets worse? It might," Evelyn admitted. "But sometimes you learn more about a person when you let them speak than when you silence them too quickly." Lena sat back, biting her lip. She admired Evelyn's restraint, but part of her wanted justice immediately. For Lena, it wasn't just about Evelyn. It was about all the women who looked like her, who would hear this story and know it could have been them. The engines roared to life then, vibrating through the cabin as the aircraft began its taxi toward the runway. Evelyn fastened her seatbelt, her movements precise, deliberate. Around her, the small chatter of passengers quieted, replaced by the hum of anticipation that always came just before takeoff. Still, she could not shake the awareness that eyes lingered on her longer than they should. When she glanced sideways, she noticed the man across the aisle had stopped scrolling. He was watching her openly now, his brows knit as if puzzling over her presence. She met his gaze with calm neutrality, and after a long beat, he looked away, pretending to be absorbed in the in-flight magazine. The aircraft surged forward, lifting off with a force that pressed passengers into their seats. Evelyn's stomach dropped briefly, then steadied as the city lights fell away beneath them. She leaned her head against the window, watching the night sky swallow the horizon. She should have felt relief. Flying had always been a kind of sanctuary for her, a place suspended between worlds where she could think, dream, plan. But tonight, the sanctuary felt fragile, invaded by suspicion and unspoken hostility. As the seatbelt sign clicked off, The business-class cabin buzzed back to life. Attendants moved about with carts, the clink of glassware echoing softly. Evelyn pulled out her notebook, flipping to a page filled with bullet points for tomorrow's meeting. Yet the words blurred as her mind returned to the pilot's face, his smirk, his tone. Not everyone belongs up here. She tapped her pen against the page, her jaw tightening. It wasn't just about her. It was about what his words represented. An entire history of exclusion, an entire narrative designed to remind people like her that success was borrowed, conditional, never fully theirs. But Evelyn knew better. She had built her company from the ground up, brick by brick, with sacrifices most of these passengers could not imagine. She belonged here not because of luck, but because of relentless, unyielding effort. Her phone buzzed softly in her bag. She pulled it out, noticing a message from Thomas that must have come through just before takeoff. Good luck tomorrow. Mom, remember, you don't need to prove anything to anyone. You already proved it to me. Evelyn's throat tightened. She closed her eyes, holding the phone to her chest for a moment before slipping it back. His words steadied her, reminding her of the only approval that mattered. The hours ahead would test her resolve in ways she could not yet see. But for now, she sat in the dim glow of the cabin, surrounded by the quiet hostility of strangers, and reminded herself of a truth stronger than any insult. She belonged, and whether they recognized it or not, she intended to make sure no one on this plane forgot it. Dinner service had just begun when the first crack in the thin veneer of civility appeared. Evelyn Carter unfolded her linen napkin and placed it across her lap. The faint clinking of cutlery and the soft rustle of fabric filled the cabin. Passengers leaned back into their seats, wine glasses catching the dim glow of overhead lights. For a moment, it almost felt ordinary, routine. But Evelyn knew the calm was deceptive. She had seen the way Captain Richard Hayes had looked at her earlier, and she felt it like a shadow even now. Though he was in the cockpit, she sensed his disdain bleeding into the cabin, infecting the way some passengers regarded her. She caught fragments of whispers, the subtle sideways glances, the flicker of amusement in eyes that pretended not to notice her. When the attendant poured her a glass of sparkling water, Evelyn offered a quiet thank you, her tone polite, steady. She refused to let them see how the weight pressed on her shoulders. Lena, seated beside her, shifted restlessly, her indignation still simmering from earlier. And then it happened. The cabin door to the cockpit opened briefly, a sliver of light spilling into the aisle. Hayes emerged, adjusting the cuffs of his uniform. He strolled down the aisle with a casual authority, his steps measured, his chin slightly lifted. He didn't need to say anything. His very presence demanded attention. When his gaze landed on Evelyn, it lingered. He stopped near her row, placing a hand on the headrest of the seat in front of her, leaning just enough to make the moment feel intentional. Passengers nearby shifted in their seats, sensing something unusual about to unfold. "Comfortable?" Hayes asked, his voice loud enough for those around to hear. Evelyn raised her eyes to him, calm and unflinching. "Quite," she replied softly. He nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching into something between a smirk and a sneer. "Well, enjoy it while you can. Seats like these are exclusive. Not everyone is suited for them." The words landed in the air like shards of glass. Conversations paused. Forks hovered mid-air. Lena gasped audibly, her hand tightening around the stem of her wine glass. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. Across the aisle, the middle-aged man who had been watching her earlier chuckled under his breath, exchanging a knowing look with the woman seated beside him. It was as if Hayes had given permission for their unspoken thoughts to be voiced aloud. Lena turned to Evelyn, her voice a hiss. "Did you hear that he's humiliating you in front of everyone?" Evelyn's heart hammered in her chest, though her face betrayed nothing. She inhaled slowly, steadying her breath. This was the choice she always faced: to react and risk confirming their expectations, or to remain calm and risk being mistaken for weak. She chose a third path. "Captain Hayes," she said evenly, her voice carrying farther than she intended, "I assure you, I am as entitled to this seat as any other passenger." A hush rippled through the cabin. Hayes straightened slightly, his expression flickering for just a moment before settling back into that smug confidence. "Of course," he said, almost too casually, "but entitlement and belonging aren't always the same thing, are they?" Gasps broke out from nearby passengers. One woman muttered, "That's too much," under her breath, while another whispered, "Did he really just say that Lena pushed back her seatbelt and half rose? You can't talk to her like that." Evelyn placed a gentle hand on her assistant's arm, stopping her. "Sit down." "Lena." Her voice was calm, but her eyes burned. Inside, though, her thoughts twisted. A younger Evelyn might have exploded, demanded the flight attendants remove him, called for corporate lawyers on the spot. But she was not the young woman clawing her way through graduate school anymore. She was a leader, a mother, a woman who had built her own empire from nothing. She could not let fury dictate her steps. Hayes leaned closer, lowering his voice but not enough to keep others from hearing. "Let's not pretend, Ms. Carter. Some people buy their way in, others earn it, and some—" His eyes flicked over her, cold and dismissive, "are simply out of place." The cruelty in his words sliced deeper than the volume in which they were spoken. He wanted her to feel small, to shrink beneath his gaze, to second-guess herself even for a moment. Instead, Evelyn tilted her chin slightly upward, her eyes locked on his. "Captain," she said softly, "the only thing out of place here is your arrogance." The statement hung in the air, quiet yet thunderous. The passengers nearby stiffened, some turning their heads quickly, as though pretending not to witness history. Lena's lips parted in astonishment. The chuckling man across the aisle stopped smiling. Hayes's nostrils flared, his jaw tightening. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then he laughed, not the light laughter of amusement, but the harsh kind, sharp-edged and dismissive. "You've got spirit, I'll give you that," he said, straightening. "But spirit doesn't change the truth." He turned abruptly and strode back toward the cockpit, leaving the cabin buzzing in his wake. Evelyn's pulse raced, her palms damp against the fabric of her skirt. She had held her ground, but the sting of his words lingered. Around her, she sensed the unease spreading. Some passengers avoided her gaze altogether, unwilling to confront what they had just heard. Others glanced at her with a strange mix of pity and admiration. Lena leaned in, her voice fierce. "You can't let him get away with that. You just can't." Evelyn looked down at her folded hands, willing them to stop trembling. "I won't," she murmured, "but not on his terms, on mine." Her mind raced as she thought of Thomas, of his words only a day earlier. Do you ever get tired of proving yourself? Yes. She did. She was tired. But in this moment, she realized she wasn't just proving something for herself anymore. Every eye in the cabin was watching. Every ear had heard Hayes's contempt. Whether she liked it or not, she had become the battleground. She straightened her posture, exhaled slowly, and lifted her glass of water. She took a slow sip, her hands steady once more. When she set the glass down, her reflection in the rim was calm, determined. This was not the end of the confrontation. It was the beginning, and Evelyn Carter knew that by the time this plane landed, nothing would ever be the same. The cabin had quieted after the confrontation, but silence did not mean peace. It was the kind of silence that crackled beneath the surface, alive with unspoken judgments and unsettled thoughts. Evelyn Carter sat upright in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap, though her chest still rose and fell faster than she wished. Outwardly, she appeared composed, but within her mind the storm was relentless. She replayed every word, every inflection in Captain Hayes's voice, the calculated cruelty behind his smirk. Not everyone belongs up here. She had faced such sentiments before, sometimes whispered, sometimes delivered with polite smiles that hid daggers, but rarely had it been so naked, so deliberate, and so public. Her gaze drifted toward the window, where the night sky stretched endlessly, stars pricking the darkness like fragile lanterns. She thought of her father, a quiet man with rough, calloused hands from years of factory work. He had taught her that dignity was not something anyone could give or take, it was something you carried inside. She remembered how he used to tuck her into bed after long shifts, telling her stories of heroes who stood tall against injustice. "You have their blood in you, Evelyn," he used to say. "Never let the world convince you otherwise." She swallowed hard. The memory filled her with warmth, but also with grief. He had not lived to see how far she had come. He had not seen her carve a path in an industry that had resisted her at every turn. And yet, in moments like this, she still felt the weight of his absence, the longing for his quiet reassurance. Beside her, Lena reached over, her fingers brushing Evelyn's hand. "You were incredible back there," she whispered. "The way you stood your ground. I don't know how you do it. I would have lost it." Evelyn offered a faint smile, though her eyes did not leave the window. "You think I didn't want to," Lena tilted her head, studying her, "but you didn't. You stayed calm, because anger gives them what they want." Evelyn murmured, "It proves their story about you, that you don't belong because you can't control yourself. They look for reasons to dismiss you. I can't hand it to them." Her words were steady, but inside, Evelyn was torn. The restraint that had become her armor often felt like a prison. She wanted to shout, to demand the respect she had earned, but every outburst risked confirming their prejudices. And so, she bottled it, over and over, until her very bones ached with the pressure. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas again. She remembered his question. "Do you ever get tired of proving yourself? Yes, God. Yes." And yet here she was, still forced to prove, to defend, to justify. It wasn't just for herself anymore. It was for him, and for all those who would walk the path behind her. A flight attendant approached quietly, placing a tray of food on Evelyn's table. "Chicken or pasta, ma'am?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with something Evelyn couldn't quite name. Was it sympathy unease? Perhaps both. Chicken, please, Evelyn replied. As the attendant set down the plate, she hesitated, then added softly, "For what it's worth, I thought you handled yourself with grace." Evelyn looked up, startled by the sincerity in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply, when the attendant walked away. Lena leaned closer, lowering her voice. "See, people notice. You're stronger than any of them." Evelyn speared a piece of chicken with her fork, though her appetite was gone. Stronger. The word echoed inside her. Everyone told her that colleagues, friends, even strangers. But strength came at a cost. And tonight, she felt the cost acutely. As she chewed slowly, her mind wandered back decades to her first job interview after graduate school. She remembered the way the panelists had looked at her resume, impressed by the degrees, the accolades, but then glanced at her as though to confirm whether she fit the picture in their minds. One man had asked her bluntly if she thought she would fit in culturally with the team. She had smiled, answered diplomatically, and walked out knowing the offer would never come. She remembered her first big investor meeting, the way they had addressed her assistant instead of her, the way they had assumed she was someone's secretary. And she remembered the fire it had lit inside her, the vow that one day they would have no choice but to see her. Every victory since then had been built on those memories. Every award, every breakthrough, every contract signed was not just a win for her company, but a rebuke to every door that had been slammed in her face. And yet, here she was, 30,000 feet above the earth, still fighting the same battle. The fork clinked softly against the plate as she set it down. She pushed the tray away and leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes. Sleep would not come, but she needed the stillness. In the quiet, Evelyn's thoughts turned darker. She wondered how many more times she would have to endure this, how many more rooms, board meetings, flights, and negotiations would come with the unspoken demand that she justify her presence. Was this endless? Would Thomas inherit the same burden? The thought twisted her insides. She wanted more for him. She wanted him to walk into a room and be judged solely by his mind, his merit, his humanity, not by the shade of his skin. A memory surfaced suddenly, unbidden. Thomas at 8 years old, standing in the schoolyard, tears streaming down his face. A group of boys had mocked him, calling him names he didn't yet fully understand. Evelyn had held him that night, whispering that he was beautiful, brilliant, worthy. But in the darkness of her own room, she had cried too, because she knew the world would try again and again to tell him otherwise. Her heart ached at the memory, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if to still the pain. She would endure 1,000 humiliations if it meant sparing him just one. But she knew she couldn't. She could only fight to change the ground beneath his feet, brick by brick, moment by moment. The plane vibrated gently with turbulence, shaking her from her thoughts. She opened her eyes, glancing around the cabin. Some passengers dozed peacefully, oblivious. Others whispered in hushed tones. A few still stole glances at her, the aftershocks of Hayes's provocation still alive. Evelyn sat straighter, smoothing her blazer once more. The battle within her raged on, but she knew how to mask it. Poise was both her shield and her weapon. Lena broke the silence again. "What are you thinking?" Evelyn turned her head slowly, her gaze calm but heavy with truth. "I'm thinking that strength is exhausting, and I'm thinking that maybe that's the point." "The point?" Lena asked softly. "They want us tired. They want us to give up. But if we do, we hand them the victory they're waiting for. So we keep standing, even when our legs shake, especially then." Lena nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "You make it sound noble." "It isn't noble," Evelyn replied, her voice almost a whisper. "It's survival." For a long time after that, neither of them spoke. The hum of the plane filled the silence, steady and unyielding. Evelyn leaned her head back, letting her eyes close again. In her mind, she saw her father, her son, the long line of ancestors who had endured far worse so that she could sit in this seat today. The memory steadied her. The struggle was heavy, but it was not hers alone. She carried generations within her, and she carried the future too. Her heart still ached, but her spirit did not break, and as the night deepened around them, Evelyn Carter sat in the shadows of the sky, her inner war raging quietly, unseen, but undefeated. The hum of the engines had become a steady background, almost like a lullaby. But Evelyn Carter could not relax. She shifted in her seat, her eyes flicking from the flight attendants moving down the aisle to the passengers who still stole glances at her. Curious, conflicted, or silently judgmental. She knew the look too well. Some carried quiet sympathy, others something harsher confirmation of biases they rarely dared to voice aloud. Lena leaned over, speaking in a low voice that only Evelyn could hear. "They're still watching. They want to see if you'll break." Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile, though her eyes betrayed no amusement. "Then they'll be disappointed." But even as she said it, she felt the weight pressing harder on her shoulders. It wasn't fair, the constant performance, always poised, always unshaken, always strong. What would happen if she simply let herself feel rage, sorrow, exhaustion without restraint? The thought unsettled her, and she pushed it aside. As the cabin lights dimmed for the overnight stretch, soft whispers filled the air. Most passengers reclined their seats, slipping into the suspended time of long-haul flights, but Evelyn remained upright, her mind buzzing too loudly for rest. She was about to close her eyes when she heard a voice, tentative yet firm, from across the aisle. "Excuse me," the middle-aged man who had chuckled earlier said. His tone was different, now quieter, almost hesitant. Evelyn turned her head slightly. Cautious, "Yes," she asked. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together as though bracing himself. I just wanted to say I don't agree with what the captain said back there." It wasn't right. Evelyn regarded him carefully, her expression unreadable. "No," she said softly. "It wasn't." The man shifted uncomfortably. His salt and pepper hair caught the faint cabin light, and his tailored suit suggested wealth, privilege, a life far different from her own beginnings. "I've seen things like that before, but it's different. Hearing it come from someone in his position, from a pilot, it felt." He paused, searching for the word. "Ugly." Lena sat forward, skeptical. "You think," she said sharply. The man looked at her, then back at Evelyn. "I just wanted you to know not everyone on this plane thinks the way he does." For a moment, Evelyn didn't respond. Part of her wanted to dismiss him, to remind him that silence in the face of injustice was its own form of agreement. Another part of her, the weary part, wondered if she could accept the gesture without dissecting it. Finally, she inclined her head slightly. "Thank you," she said. His shoulders loosened, relief flickering across his face. "I'm Mark. By the way, Mark Ellison." "Evelyn Carter," she replied evenly. though she suspected he already knew. Most people in business class did. Yes, he admitted with a small smile. I recognized you. You've built quite the company. My daughter actually quoted one of your interviews in a paper she wrote on women in leadership. She admires you. Evelyn blinked, momentarily caught off guard. She wasn't used to hearing stories like that in such unexpected places. She did, Mark said firmly. She looks up to women like you, which is why I hated hearing what he said. It's not just wrong, it's dangerous. It sends a message to the younger generation that some people don't deserve to be where they've earned their place. That's poison. His words struck Evelyn, though she masked it well. She thought of Thomas, of the countless young black children who might one day find themselves in her shoes. Questioned, doubted, diminished. She thought of the ripple effects of every moment like this. How prejudice did not just wound one person, but sought to shape entire narratives. You're right, she said quietly. It is poison, and it spreads easily when no one speaks against it. Mark hesitated, then leaned closer. Then maybe it's time more of us spoke up. I regret not saying something right then. When he stood here, I should have, but I didn't, and I don't want to make that mistake again. Evelyn studied him, her sharp eyes reading the sincerity in his face. She sensed he wasn't trying to absolve himself. He was trying, clumsily perhaps, to shoulder a part of the burden she had carried alone for too long. You have a voice, she said slowly. Use it when it counts, not afterward, when the moment has passed. He nodded, the truth of her words landing with weight. Lena crossed her arms, still wary. Words are easy, she muttered. Mark looked at her directly. Then, let me prove it. Evelyn didn't reply, but something in her chest shifted, a flicker of hope, or perhaps just curiosity. For years, she had fought battles in boardrooms, classrooms, and flights like this, often alone. The idea of an ally, not someone speaking for her, but beside her, felt both unfamiliar and quietly profound. As the night deepened, the cabin grew quieter still. Passengers drifted into sleep. But Evelyn remained awake, her mind turning over the exchange. She wondered if Mark's words would matter in the end, or if they would vanish like so many promises she'd heard before. Yet she couldn't deny that his daughter's admiration stirred something inside her. She pictured the young woman, pen in hand, quoting Evelyn's words with conviction, perhaps finding courage for her own path. That thought steadied Evelyn's heart in a way nothing else had that night. Later, when Mark excused himself to the restroom, Lena leaned toward Evelyn, her voice hushed. Do you trust him? Evelyn exhaled slowly. I don't know, but trust isn't the point. What matters is whether he acts when the next moment comes. And you think it will? Lena asked. Evelyn's gaze flicked toward the cockpit door, still closed, still heavy with unspoken tension. Yes, she murmured. It will. Inside. Evelyn wrestled with herself. She wanted to believe in allies, in support that wasn't fleeting. But experience had taught her caution. Too many people had claimed solidarity only when it cost them nothing. Too many had chosen comfort over courage. Still, the memory of Mark's words, his daughter's paper, lingered, and for the first time that night, Evelyn felt something other than exhaustion. She felt the faintest pulse of possibility. She adjusted her seat, closing her eyes briefly. The engines roared gently in the background, steady and certain. Above the vast ocean, in the dim glow of the cabin, Evelyn Carter allowed herself to breathe a little easier. because though the battle was far from over, she was no longer entirely alone. The hours passed slowly, the airplane carving its invisible trail across the night sky. Somewhere, far below, entire continents slept, unaware of the storm brewing 30,000 feet above. Evelyn Carter had finally let her body recline, though her mind refused to rest. Each time her eyes closed, she saw Richard Hayes's face, heard his words dripping with disdain, felt the sting of his contempt echoing across the cabin. For a brief while, she allowed herself to drift in and out of shallow dreams, her father's voice, her son's laughter, the sound of applause in boardrooms where she had defied every expectation. But the fragile calm shattered when the cockpit door opened once again. Captain Hayes stepped out, his posture commanding, his presence disruptive. This time, he didn't stroll casually. His movements were sharper, his jaw clenched. Something in his eyes had changed, less smugness, more calculation. He scanned the cabin, and though his gaze swept across dozens of passengers, it stopped only when it landed on Evelyn. She felt the focus like a spotlight. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice firm, carrying through the quiet cabin. "I hope you're all comfortable. I just wanted to inform you of some slight turbulence ahead. Nothing to worry about. But please keep your seatbelts fastened." A ripple of murmurs passed through the passengers, some tightening their belts, others barely noticing. It was a routine announcement, the kind delivered thousands of times a day by pilots around the world. But the way Hayes lingered in the aisle afterward betrayed something else. He wasn't here to reassure. He was here to provoke. His steps drew him closer until he stood once more at Evelyn's row. He leaned against a seat, folding his arms, addressing no one in particular, but making sure everyone nearby could hear. "Flying at this altitude takes precision, discipline, and above all, trust," he said smoothly. "Passengers trust us to guide them safely. They trust we know who should and shouldn't be here." Evelyn's muscles tightened. This was no subtle barb. This was open theater. Mark Ellison, seated across the aisle, shifted uncomfortably. His earlier resolve flickered in his eyes. Lena stiffened beside Evelyn, her face flushing with anger. "He's doing it again," she whispered furiously. Evelyn sat perfectly still, her silence deliberate. But Hayes pressed further. "Of course," he continued, his eyes sliding toward her. "Trust can be fragile. Once it's broken, it's hard to repair. That's why certain standards exist, standards of appearance, standards of conduct, standards that remind people why some of us are here, and why some don't quite fit." The words were sharp enough to draw audible gasps. A young woman, 2 rows back, muttered, "This is unbelievable." Another passenger leaned toward his companion, whispering fiercely, "He can't say that." Mark finally spoke. His voice was calm but steady. "Captain Hayes, with all due respect, that's not appropriate." Hayes turned his head slowly, regarding him with cool amusement. "And who might you be, just a passenger?" Mark replied, his tone firm. "But one who doesn't appreciate watching someone be singled out like this." For a moment, the cabin froze. Hayes smirked, shaking his head. "You don't understand, sir. This isn't about singling anyone out. It's about maintaining standards that keep everyone comfortable." Evelyn's voice, when it came, was quiet but carried farther than she intended. "Comfort for whom?" "Captain," his eyes snapped back to her. "For everyone who earned their place." The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn could hear her own heartbeat. feel the eyes of strangers fixed upon her. She inhaled slowly, then released it, her voice calm yet unyielding. "I have earned everything I am and everything I have, and I will not allow you or anyone to suggest otherwise." Something flickered in Hayes's expression, a crack in his mask of control. His smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Bold words," he said coldly, "but words don't change reality." Lena could no longer contain herself. She rose slightly from her seat, her voice shaking with anger. "Reality is a woman sitting here with more dignity and strength than you'll ever understand. Reality is you abusing your position to humiliate her because you can't stomach the truth that she belongs here, and you can't stand it." The cabin buzzed instantly with reactions. Some passengers nodded, murmuring agreement. Others looked away, uncomfortable. Hayes's jaw clenched as he turned sharply on his heel, striding back toward the cockpit. The door closed behind him with a heavy, deliberate slam. Evelyn sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Lena sank back into her seat, her chest heaving. "I couldn't stay quiet. I just couldn't." "You did what you felt was right," Evelyn said softly, though her gaze remained fixed on the cockpit door. Mark leaned across the aisle, his voice low but urgent. "This isn't just about you anymore, Ms. Carter. Everyone on this plane just saw what he's doing. He's trying to use his authority to demean you, to make you doubt yourself, to make the rest of us complicit in silence. We can't let him succeed." Evelyn turned her head, meeting his eyes. For the first time, she saw not hesitation but conviction. "You said earlier you regretted not speaking up in the moment," she reminded him. "This is your moment. Mr. Ellison, don't waste it." He nodded once, determination settling on his face. The cabin gradually returned to its uneasy quiet, but Evelyn knew the atmosphere had changed. The passengers had witnessed more than discomfort. They had witnessed a clash between power abused and dignity defended. The tension was no longer hidden. It pulsed in the air, impossible to ignore. As she sat back, Evelyn's mind turned inward again. She felt the familiar tug-of-war within her exhaustion and resolve, doubt and defiance. She thought of her father's voice, her son's question, her own unrelenting battle. She thought of the countless eyes watching her now, silently asking whether she would bend or stand tall, and she knew her answer. When this plane landed, the world would hear the truth. Whether Hayes realized it or not, his attempt to diminish her had set something larger in motion. Evelyn Carter was no longer just defending herself. She was holding a mirror to everyone on that flight, forcing them to choose where they stood. The engines droned on, steady and indifferent, carrying them toward their destination. But for Evelyn, the journey had already changed everything. She leaned back against the headrest, her face calm once more, her spirit burning quietly within her. This was not the end. It was only the beginning. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet after Hayes's latest display, but it was the kind of quiet that prickled the skin like the air before a storm. Evelyn Carter sat upright, her eyes fixed on the cockpit door as though she could pierce through it, as though she could confront the man hiding behind the authority of his uniform. She felt Lena's energy beside her, tense, restless, protective. Mark Ellison shifted across the aisle. His expression hardened now with something Evelyn hadn't seen before resolve. Passengers who had once tried to avert their eyes now exchanged glances. The silence between them heavy with unspoken agreement. The tide was shifting, and Hayes must have felt it too, because when the cockpit door opened again, he didn't emerge with routine calm. He came out like a man on the offensive. Hayes strode into the aisle, shoulders squared, his gaze sweeping the cabin, his voice carried loudly, sharper than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need to remind you all that this is my aircraft. While you're on board, your safety, your comfort, and yes, your order are my responsibility." Passengers stiffened. Evelyn remained still, her face unreadable. Hayes's eyes flicked toward her, then back to the group. Sometimes disruptions occur. Sometimes passengers forget their place or attempt to challenge the authority that keeps all of you safe at 30,000 feet. That will not be tolerated. Lena's jaw dropped. "Is he serious?" she hissed. Mark's hand gripped his armrest, his knuckles white. "He's trying to paint you as the problem," he muttered to Evelyn. Hayes pressed on. "I've flown hundreds of flights, carried thousands of passengers, and I'll say this plainly, there are standards for who belongs in this cabin. Standards some don't meet, no matter how loudly they insist otherwise. The words cut like blades, deliberate, public." Evelyn inhaled deeply, her chest rising with measured control. Every instinct screamed at her to rise, to confront him directly, but she forced herself to remain calm. If he wanted her anger, he would not have it. A voice rang out from the back. "That's enough." The cabin turned. A woman stood in the aisle tall, with silver hair and eyes ablaze. "You don't get to humiliate people from that position. You think your uniform gives you the right to belittle paying passengers, to single out a woman who has done nothing but sit in her seat." Hayes froze for a moment. Surprised? He hadn't expected open defiance. The woman's voice grew stronger. "I don't care if you've flown 1,000 flights. If this is how you treat people, you don't deserve to fly another one." Murmurs erupted. Some passengers clapped quietly. Others nodded, emboldened. The silence of complicity was breaking, and Hayes could feel control slipping. His face hardened. "This isn't your decision," he snapped. "This is my aircraft, and I decide how order is maintained." Mark rose halfway from his seat, his voice cutting through. "Order isn't humiliation. Captain, order isn't prejudice. Order is respect, and you've shown none." The cabin roared with agreement. Hayes's composure cracked further, his mouth tightening, his skin flushed with anger. His eyes darted toward Evelyn, as though daring her to respond, daring her to rise to his bait. Evelyn finally stood. The motion was slow, deliberate, commanding. Her height, her presence, her calm composure drew every eye in the cabin. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Captain Hayes," she said evenly, "this is not your private kingdom. This is a commercial flight. These passengers are not subjects under your rule. They are people who trusted you to get them safely to their destination." Her words struck cleanly. The woman with silver hair clapped once, sharply, and others joined. The sound swelled, echoing through the cabin like a declaration. Hayes's authority, once absolute, now trembled beneath the weight of collective defiance. Hayes's lips thinned. "You think you can turn this plane against me?" Evelyn's eyes held his steadily. "No, Captain. You did that yourself." The tension crackled, electric. For the first time, Hayes looked uncertain. His authority had always been his armor, but now it was slipping, dented not by Evelyn alone but by a chorus of witnesses unwilling to stay silent. Lena rose beside Evelyn, her voice strong, unwavering. You're not fit to lead this flight. Not if this is how you treat your passengers. Every word you've said proves it." Hayes's voice faltered as he tried to recover ground. I was only reminding everyone of what Mark cut in." His voice sharp. "That prejudice masquerades as professionalism, that your standards are nothing but excuses for cruelty." The cabin buzzed louder. Passengers whispered, nodded, muttered words of agreement. Evelyn felt the momentum shifting entirely, the balance of power tilting away from Hayes. Inside, however, her thoughts churned. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every person watching. Every silent witness who had seen prejudice dressed as authority and wondered if they had the courage to speak. She could feel her father's voice inside her, urging her to stand firm, to carry not just her own dignity but that of generations before her. Hayes's hand twitched at his side, frustration radiating from him. He muttered something under his breath, then spun on his heel, storming back toward the cockpit. The slam of the door echoed through the cabin like a closing gavel. The silence that followed was unlike the others. It wasn't uneasy, it was charged, alive, filled with energy. Passengers turned to Evelyn, some murmuring words of support, others simply meeting her eyes with nods of respect. The silver-haired woman approached, placing a hand lightly on Evelyn's arm. "You stood tall when it mattered. Thank you." Evelyn offered a small, humble smile. "Thank you for speaking, too. Courage spreads when it's shared." The woman's eyes softened. "My name's Ruth. If my granddaughter had been here, I'd want her to see what you just did." The words pierced Evelyn's heart with unexpected warmth. She thought of Thomas again, his wide, searching eyes, his constant questions about what it meant to live with dignity. She thought of how this moment, painful as it was, might one day shape the world he inherited. As Ruth returned to her seat, Mark leaned forward. "He won't let this go, not after being challenged like that." Evelyn exhaled slowly. "I know, but neither will we." Lena squeezed her hand firmly. "We're with you. All of us now." Evelyn looked around the cabin, at the faces no longer blank or silent, but awake, engaged, ready, for the first time since Hayes had begun his cruel campaign. She felt something more powerful than exhaustion. She felt solidarity. The engines hummed on, carrying them closer to dawn. But Evelyn knew the night was not done testing her. Hayes would act again, she was certain. And when he did, the true battle would begin. Still, she felt the fire inside her burn brighter. This was no longer about endurance. This was about transformation, and she would not falter. The night sky stretched endless outside the oval windows, a black canvas speckled with faint stars. Inside, the air was heavier than the pressurized cabin could explain. Every passenger felt it, the knowledge that something had shifted irreversibly. Captain Hayes had lost the room, yet his authority still cloaked him like a uniformed shield. Evelyn Carter sat poised, her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. She projected calm, but inside, a storm raged, every insult replayed in her mind, every flash of doubt, every moment she had been forced to perform strength to survive. A part of her longed to retreat, to bury herself in silence until the plane touched ground. But another part, the larger part, knew this wasn't just about her anymore. Too many eyes had witnessed. Too many hearts now beat with borrowed courage. The cockpit door opened again. Hayes emerged, his face flushed, his composure rattled. He had been alone with his thoughts for nearly an hour, stewing, and now he looked like a man cornered by his own pride. His gaze swept the cabin, landing squarely on Evelyn. "Mrs. Carter," he said loudly, his tone dripping with forced civility. "A word." The passengers stiffened. Some craned their necks to watch, others whispered nervously. Evelyn didn't move. "If you have something to say, Captain, you can say it here. Everyone deserves to hear it." Gasps rippled. Lena grabbed Evelyn's arm gently, whispering, "Are you sure Evelyn's eyes never left Hayes?" "Yes." His jaw tightened. "Very well." He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her seat. "You have challenged me in front of my passengers. You've turned this cabin into a spectacle. Do you understand the danger of undermining authority? At 30,000 feet, Evelyn's voice was steady. Authority is only legitimate when it is just. Otherwise, it's tyranny in uniform." A murmur of approval spread. Someone clapped softly. Hayes's nostrils flared. "You think you can lead this cabin better than I can?" he demanded, his voice rising. Evelyn stood slowly, her movements measured, graceful. The entire plane seemed to rise with her. Breaths caught, eyes fixed. She faced him fully now, unflinching. "I don't have to lead this cabin, Captain. I only have to stand against the injustice you've brought into it, and I will." The tension snapped like a taut wire. Hayes's hand twitched at his side, his control slipping visibly. He stepped closer, invading her space. Lena stood immediately, shielding Evelyn instinctively. Mark rose across the aisle, his voice sharp. "Step back, Captain." Hayes sneered. "You passengers think you know better. You think you understand what it takes to fly a vessel like this." A voice called from the back. "Ruth, the silver-haired woman. Flying a plane doesn't give you the right to belittle the people inside it." Applause erupted. Louder this time, stronger. Passengers clapped. Some even stood, their voices rising in support. "She's right," someone shouted. "We've had enough." Hayes's face reddened. His authority was crumbling with every passing second, and he knew it. Yet instead of retreating, he doubled down, his pride too inflated to bend. "You're playing with fire," he barked. "All of you. You want to challenge the man keeping you safe in the sky? Do you have any idea how reckless that is?" Evelyn's voice cut cleanly through the noise. "Safety isn't threatened by truth. It's threatened by arrogance." The applause swelled again. The cabin had shifted decisively now, no longer a passive audience but an active chorus. Hayes looked around, realizing he was outnumbered, his power eroded. Still, he clung to his authority with desperate hands. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice lower but venomous. Evelyn didn't flinch. "The only thing I'll regret is if I stay silent." The silence that followed wasn't fragile this time. It was heavy, united, waiting. Hayes's breathing grew ragged. He looked at the sea of faces turned against him. Passengers no longer cowed but emboldened, no longer silent but defiant. Something in his eyes broke, then not authority, but fear. Fear of exposure, fear of losing the power he had abused. He spun sharply and stormed back to the cockpit, the slam of the door echoing like thunder. The cabin exhaled in unison. Evelyn sat slowly, her pulse pounding, her body trembling though her face remained calm. Lena squeezed her hand fiercely. "You were brilliant, absolutely brilliant." Mark leaned across the aisle, his eyes blazing. "You've turned the tide. He knows it now. He can't silence this." Ruth approached again, her silver hair gleaming under the cabin light. "Do you realize what you just did?" she asked softly, reverently. Evelyn's lips curved faintly. "I did what I had to." "No," Ruth said firmly. "You did what we all should have." Her words struck deep. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. She hadn't asked to be the symbol, the vessel for this collective defiance, but here she was, carrying it because silence had demanded too much, for too long. Passengers began to murmur openly now, conversations buzzing. Some spoke of writing complaints, others of demanding answers when they landed. A young man near the back raised his phone, whispering, "People need to know what happened here." Lena's eyes widened. "They're recording," she whispered to Evelyn. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, then opened them with quiet resolve. Good. Let the truth fly further than this plane ever will. For the first time that night, she felt not just resistance but momentum, an unstoppable current that had shifted from one voice to many. The struggle wasn't over, but something fundamental had broken open. As the engines hummed steadily, Evelyn looked out the window at the vast darkness beyond. She thought of her father, of Thomas, of every time she had been told she didn't belong. Tonight, she hadn't just endured, she had fought back, and others had risen with her. She whispered to herself, so softly only Lena could hear, "This is bigger than me now." Lena squeezed her hand. It always was, and in that quiet, Evelyn Carter knew the breaking point at 30,000 feet was also the beginning of something new. The hum of the engines had become a backdrop to something larger now, almost like the steady drum of a heartbeat. The passengers no longer sat in passive silence. They exchanged glances, whispered conversations, their energy tethered to the moment Evelyn Carter had ignited. It was no longer just about one woman standing against a captain's cruelty. It was about all of them reclaiming their dignity inside a skybound cage. Evelyn sat with her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead. She had always carried herself with composure, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just her battle anymore, it was everyone's, the solidarity of strangers wrapped around her like armor. Yet the storm inside her had not quieted. She could feel her heart racing, feel the weight of eyes and expectations pressing down. She reminded herself to breathe. Lena leaned closer, her voice low. "He's cornered now. You've exposed him. Everyone saw it. Everyone felt it." Evelyn gave a faint nod, though her mind spun with questions. What would Hayes do next? Could he retaliate? Could he twist this narrative when they landed? Doubt tugged at her chest. But she steadied herself with the thought of her son's wide, curious eyes. "Thomas will one day ask what I did when it mattered. I can't tell him I stayed quiet." The cockpit door opened again. Every head turned. Hayes stepped out, his face pale but hard, his jaw set like stone. But something about him looked different this time, less controlled, more fragile, as though the weight of dozens of defiant stares had worn down his armor. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice still carrying authority, though thinner now, "I recognize that some of you may have concerns about earlier interactions. Let me assure you, my priority remains your safety." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. It sounded like an attempt at repair, but the passengers weren't buying it. Ruth, the silver-haired woman, spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Safety without respect isn't safety. We deserve both." Applause followed instantly, sharp and clear. Hayes's lips pressed into a thin line. Mark Ellison stood slowly, commanding attention. Captain Hayes, I'll say this plainly. What we witnessed tonight was not professional. It was not about safety. It was about prejudice, and we will not let it pass unchallenged. The cabin echoed with agreement. Some passengers voiced support out loud. That's right, we'll report this. We saw everything. Hayes faltered. His hands curled into fists at his sides. You don't understand the pressures of this job. Evelyn rose before he could finish, her voice calm but carrying the full weight of conviction. We don't need to understand your pressures to recognize cruelty. We don't need to sit in the cockpit to know the difference between leadership and abuse. Her words cut through the cabin like a bell. The passengers clapped louder now, not just polite support, but a rhythm of solidarity. Some even stood with her, as though physically aligning themselves against Hayes's power. Hayes's face reddened. His control was slipping fast, and everyone could see it. Evelyn stepped forward, closing the space between them just enough to make her presence undeniable. You tried to humiliate me. You tried to shrink me into silence. But look around you. Captain, every time you pushed, more voices rose against you. Every time you tried to diminish me, you diminished yourself instead. The cabin fell silent, the truth hanging thick in the air. Hayes's mouth opened as though to reply. But nothing came. His authority had drained away under the weight of collective defiance. Ruth spoke again, her voice clear and resolute. You are unfit to carry passengers if this is how you treat them, and we will make sure the world knows it. Hayes's eyes darted from face to face, every passenger a witness, every expression a verdict. For the first time, he looked small. He turned sharply and retreated once more into the cockpit. The slam of the door sounding less like power and more like surrender. Evelyn sat slowly, her body trembling with adrenaline. Lena's hand closed tightly around hers. You won, she whispered, tears in her eyes. But Evelyn shook her head gently. This isn't about winning. It's about changing what we refuse to accept. Mark leaned forward, his voice steady. When we land, I'll stand with you. I'll speak to the airline, the press, anyone who'll listen. He doesn't get to walk away from this untouched. Others joined quickly. Ruth raised her hand. Me too. I'll give my testimony. My voice matters. A younger passenger chimed in. I recorded some of it. People need to see. People need to hear. Evelyn's throat tightened. For so long, she'd carried her battles quietly, silently, never expecting strangers to share the burden. And now, here they were, an unexpected army forged in the sky. She looked out the window, the horizon faintly glowing with the first traces of dawn. The light broke slowly, gently, painting the clouds with streaks of gold and lavender. A new day was coming, literally and metaphorically. She whispered, almost to herself, the truth always finds light. Lena squeezed her hand, and you are the reason it shines brighter tonight. The rest of the flight passed in charged stillness. Hayes did not emerge again. The passengers spoke in low murmurs, planning, committing to action. Evelyn leaned back, exhaustion settling over her, but beneath it pulsed something fierce, something unshakable. She thought of her father's words echoing across her childhood. Dignity is not given, it is claimed tonight at 30,000 feet. She had claimed it not just for herself, but for everyone who believed silence was their only option. And when the wheels touched down, she knew the fight would not end. It would only grow. The descent began with a soft chime, followed by the familiar announcement of seat belts and tray tables. But there was nothing familiar about the atmosphere in the cabin. The hum of the engines no longer drowned out tension. Instead, it felt like a drum roll building toward something inevitable. Evelyn Carter sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap, though her body pulsed with unease. She could feel Lena's presence beside her, steady, loyal, protective, and Mark's watchful gaze from across the aisle. Ruth caught Evelyn's eye from a few rows back, nodding slightly, a silent pledge of support. The world below glowed faintly through the windows. City lights spread like constellations on the ground, and with every passing moment, the plane drew closer to landing. Yet Evelyn knew the confrontation hadn't ended in the air. It was merely suspended, waiting for the earth to reclaim them. The cockpit door opened. Hayes stepped out one final time, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched. The passengers stiffened too, every eye tracking his movements. He cleared his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice sharp but strained, "we'll be landing shortly. I expect you to follow standard procedures and remain seated until we reach the gate." No one responded, no polite smiles, no murmurs of acknowledgement, just silence, a collective verdict. Hayes's eyes flicked to Evelyn, but this time, instead of confrontation, he found something worse, rejection. She no longer needed to speak. The passenger's silence spoke for her. The descent continued. The engines roared louder, the pressure building in everyone's ears, the lights of the runway drawing closer. Evelyn pressed her palm against the armrest, steadying herself. She thought of her son. "Thomas, if he ever asks me what courage looks like, I want him to know it looks like standing tall, even when your knees shake." The wheels touched down with a jolt. The plane thundered along the runway, then slowed, coasting toward the gate. A hush blanketed the cabin, not of fear this time, but of anticipation. As soon as the seatbelt sign dinged off, voices rose in unison. "I'm reporting this. We need to speak to someone in charge." This was unacceptable. Passengers gathered their belongings, but their focus wasn't on luggage. It was on justice. Hayes's face reddened as the murmur grew louder, the energy swelling like a storm ready to break. Lena leaned toward Evelyn, whispering, "They're with you. Every single one." Evelyn's chest tightened. It was one thing to stand alone, but another to feel an entire cabin rise beside her. The plane stopped at the gate. The door opened, and flight attendants, tense, uncertain, moved down the aisle, attempting to usher passengers out. But no one rushed. Instead, they lingered, standing near Evelyn, waiting. Then came the officials, two airline supervisors, sharp in their uniforms, accompanied by airport security. They entered the cabin briskly, their eyes sweeping the tense scene. One of them, a tall woman with a clipped tone, spoke loudly. "Captain Hayes, what's the issue here?" Hayes stepped forward quickly, eager, his voice defensive. Disruptive passenger, interfered with operations, tried to undermine authority in flight. Gasps erupted. Lena shot up instantly. "That's a lie." Mark moved forward too, his voice firm. "We all witnessed what happened." Evelyn Carter was calm, respectful. The only person disruptive here was him. Ruth added her voice. He tried to humiliate her in front of everyone. He crossed a line no captain should cross. Dozens of nods followed. passengers began speaking at once, their voices overlapping. "She did nothing wrong. We'll testify. He was out of control." The supervisors hesitated, glancing between Hayes and the sea of united passengers. Hayes's face flushed darker, his composure slipping further. Evelyn stood then, slowly, her presence commanding without raising her voice. "I am Evelyn Carter. I have nothing to hide. This man tried to strip me of dignity at 30,000 feet. But dignity is not his to take. Not from me, not from anyone." The cabin erupted in applause. The officials exchanged uneasy looks. Hayes sputtered, trying to recover. "You don't understand. She was questioning my authority." Mark cut in sharply. "Authority is not a license for abuse, and every single person here will back that up." One of the supervisors raised a hand. "We'll need statements." Passengers immediately agreed. Some pulled out phones, holding up recordings. Ruth stepped forward. "You'll have mine first." Evelyn's chest swelled not with pride exactly, but with something heavier, more humbling. She had carried the weight alone for so long. Now, others carried it with her. Hayes's shoulders slumped as the supervisors led him toward the exit. He protested weakly, muttering about misunderstanding and safety protocols, but the sight of dozens of passengers staring him down stripped his words of power. For the first time, Hayes looked small as he disappeared down the jet bridge. A strange quiet settled in the cabin. It wasn't relief exactly. It was the quiet after battle, when adrenaline fades but the weight of what's been endured remains. Lena touched Evelyn's arm gently. "You did it. You really did it." Evelyn exhaled, her body trembling now that the confrontation was over. "We did it," she corrected softly. "Every one of us." Ruth approached again, her eyes warm. "I'll be telling this story to my granddaughter. I'll tell her about the woman who stood tall in the sky and reminded us all what courage looks like." Evelyn's throat tightened. She placed her hand over Ruth's. "Thank you. Your voice mattered tonight more than you know." As passengers filed out, many paused to squeeze Evelyn's hand, to offer words of gratitude, to assure her they would follow through. Mark lingered at the door, his briefcase in hand. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "I've spent years in boardrooms thinking leadership was about power. Tonight, you showed me it's about something else entirely. It's about standing firm when it costs the most." Evelyn smiled faintly. Then maybe tonight wasn't wasted after all. When she finally stepped off the plane, the terminal lights felt harsh after the dim cabin. But with every step, Evelyn sensed the shift within herself, within the people who had walked beside her. The fight wasn't finished. There would be reports, media, consequences, but the most important victory had already been won in the sky. For the first time in hours, Evelyn allowed herself to breathe deeply. She thought of Thomas again, his voice echoing in her memory, "Mom, what does brave mean?" Now she had an answer. The airport terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of late-night arrivals. Suitcases rolled over polished tiles. Children clutched tired parents' hands. Announcements echoed overhead. Yet for the passengers of Flight 782, the ground beneath their feet felt different, charged with the echoes of what had unfolded at 30,000 feet. Evelyn Carter stepped into the terminal slowly, Lena beside her like a protective shadow. The crowd thinned as passengers went their separate ways, but many lingered close, unwilling to sever the invisible thread that now bound them together. It was as though they all carried the same invisible weight. one born in the narrow cabin and now carried into the wider world. Mark Ellison approached with steady steps, his briefcase swinging at his side. His voice carried both exhaustion and conviction. "I've already emailed my office. By tomorrow morning, the right people will hear what happened. I'll make sure your voice and ours doesn't get buried." Ruth joined them too, her silver hair catching the fluorescent light. She rested a gentle hand on Evelyn's arm. "You've given us more than courage tonight. You reminded us that silence is complicity. We can't afford silence anymore." Evelyn nodded, her throat tight. She had expected confrontation, humiliation, even dismissal, but not this solidarity. It humbled her more deeply than applause or victory ever could. She whispered, almost to herself, "It wasn't just me, it was all of us." Lena touched her arm gently. "Still, you were the spark. Don't forget that." Airport officials moved briskly near the gate, their walkie-talkies crackling, their expressions tense. Evelyn noticed Hayes in the distance, flanked by supervisors. His posture was rigid, but his eyes darted nervously. For once, he wasn't the man in command. He was the man being watched, scrutinized, held accountable. Evelyn turned away. She didn't need to see him anymore. His story no longer held power over hers. Outside the terminal, the night air was crisp. The city lights stretched endlessly, neon and halogen blending into a restless glow. Passengers slowly dispersed into taxis, buses, ride shares, their lives waiting to resume. But for Evelyn, there was no simple return to normal. Something fundamental had shifted. Lena tugged at her sleeve. "Your car is here." They slid into the back seat together, the leather cool against their skin. The driver glanced in the mirror, then smiled politely. Long flight, Evelyn met his eyes briefly, then let her gaze fall back to the window. Longer than most. She murmured. The city rushed by outside, headlights weaving, billboards flashing, but Evelyn's mind wasn't on the scenery. It drifted back to the cabin, to Ruth's trembling voice rising against Hayes, to Mark's steady defense, to the passengers who had chosen courage over convenience. She replayed every moment and realized something striking justice hadn't begun when the plane touched down. It had begun the moment silence ended. Lena broke the quiet. "You should rest. You've been through hell tonight." Evelyn shook her head. "I can't rest yet, not until I decide what comes next." Her assistant tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Evelyn looked out at the glowing skyline. "This isn't just a story about a pilot and a passenger. It's a story about power and dignity. If we let it fade, then we've learned nothing." "I won't let it fade." Lena studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You've always been relentless. It's what makes you extraordinary." The car pulled up in front of Evelyn's townhouse. She stepped out into the night, the cool air brushing her face. For the first time in hours, she allowed herself to inhale deeply, to fill her lungs with something that felt like freedom. Inside, the quiet was heavy but comforting. Evelyn moved through the room slowly, her hand brushing the edge of the table, the back of the sofa, grounding herself. Finally, she climbed the stairs to her son's room. Thomas slept soundly, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm, his curls tangle on the pillow. Evelyn leaned against the doorframe, her heart softening. She thought of his earlier question, "Mom, what does brave mean tonight?" She had lived the answer. She approached quietly, kneeling by his bed. For a long moment, she simply watched him. The innocence of his sleep a stark contrast to the cruelty she had endured hours before. Then she whispered, so softly only she could hear. Brave means standing up when the world wants you to sit down. Brave means saying no when silence feels easier. Brave means never letting anyone take away your worth. Her throat tightened. She pressed a kiss to his forehead, lingering, then pulled back with tears glistening in her eyes. Downstairs. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. The house was still, but her mind was alive. She thought about the recordings the passengers had taken, the statements they had promised to give. She thought about the supervisor's uncertain eyes, about Hayes's collapse, about the applause that had filled the cabin like thunder. She knew the days ahead would be hard. The airline would resist. Lawyers would circle. Hayes might spin his story. But Evelyn had something stronger than any of them: truth, witnesses, and the undeniable force of solidarity. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something else to hope. The morning light began to seep through the blinds, pale and tentative. Evelyn watched it spread across the floor, painting the room in muted gold. She realized she had not slept, but she didn't feel drained. She felt awake, alive, as though she had stepped into a new chapter of her life. She picked up her phone. Messages already blinked across the screen: texts from Lena, from Mark, from passengers she barely knew but who now felt like comrades. Articles were already appearing online. Words like discrimination, courage, injustice, resilience. The story was spreading, flying faster than the jet that had carried it. Evelyn set the phone down, her lips curving into the faintest smile. Tonight had not broken her. It had revealed her. She whispered to herself, her voice steady, her spirit unyielding. This is only the beginning. Outside, the sun broke fully over the horizon, flooding the city with light. A new day had come, and with it, a new dawn for Evelyn Carter, for everyone who had found their voice in the dark cabin of Flight 782, and for every silent heart that would now dare to speak. Evelyn Carter's story reminds us of something we cannot afford to forget. Prejudice thrives in silence. But justice rises when voices unite. What began as one woman's humiliation became an awakening for everyone on that flight and for all of us who refuse to look away. It is not enough to condemn discrimination in whispers. We must call it out, loudly, together. Evelyn's courage shows us that even at 30,000 feet, even when isolated in the narrow aisle of a plane, dignity can be defended, and once defended, it can never again be taken so easily. But this story is not just about one night or one woman. It is about every act of quiet injustice we witness in our daily lives. Will we look down and pretend we don't see? Or will we choose, like those passengers, to rise carry this story with you? Remember Evelyn's calm strength, Ruth's clear voice, Mark's steady support, and the power of strangers who refuse to stay silent. Because the fight against prejudice isn't finished, it continues with each of us. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Together, let's keep these stories alive and make sure the world is watching.